very much, Gordon, and welcome to everyone today. It's so fantastic to have so many distinguished guests in the room, and I look forward to all of us learning from each other. Now, I've got a wonderful panel here with me today of experts on this topic of sustainability and security challenges. We have with us Eleonore Lebre from the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland, and Natalie from Deakin University as well. So I'm going to call this session a rapid deep dive. We've only got 25 minutes, but we really want to pull apart some of these issues and really drill down a little bit deeper into the sustainability side of critical materials. So I might start with you, Eleonore. If that's okay, if you could begin by sort of telling us about what are some of the principal sustainability challenges faced in contemporary critical materials supply chains.
Thanks, Erin. Well, first of all, I thought I would start with kind of defining what criticality really is. There is always two sides of criticality. It's the supply risk side, and there is the vulnerability to supply restrictions, which is basically how badly we need the materials. And I think the most current issue on this is the low carbon energy transition and our need to mitigate climate change. Renewable energies, electric vehicles, batteries all need, they have higher metal requirements than fossil fuels. So by transitioning to a low carbon economy, we're going to need more metals. Of course, there is a specialty metals like lithium, cobalt that we need for specific applications, but also major metals like aluminium, iron for steel, or copper. And for these ones that we need already for lots of other applications, we are going to need them even more with this transition. So that's how the question of how badly we need them. But then there is a question of sourcing. So if we need them more, but we also want to move towards a more sustainable development and mitigate climate change, but also what about the disruption that mining can cause at a more local level in other parts of the world. So it's that idea of potential trade-off that I think is the major issue. And when you look at social and environmental and political indicators, you think it's not really about scarcity of materials. It's more about the access to the land. And to access the land, you rely on a local context that is made of a social context, environmental and political aspects to it. And I think, to me, this land access is key. And it's about where are the resources located. It's about the spatial distribution. When you look at these aspects, cobalt and platinum are probably the most critical. Then you have the rare earths, you have manganese, you have nickel, and to a lesser extent you also have copper and lithium. But copper and lithium have other issues, like they are located in areas where there is more water scarcity. So it's the idea of, okay, there is a trade-off there, accessing the minerals, but also potentially competing with other users for water. So it relates also to social aspects. So it's a very complex area.
So it's this complex intersection between all of these different social, economic, environmental, political factors. Natalie, what do you see as some of those, I guess, principal challenges at the moment in terms of supply chains?
Sure. So I suppose the three key issues that I wanted to talk about today were supply chains and the need for more information along those supply chains, and a way that Australia, I believe, might be able to promote itself as what I was thinking about last night, trying to come up with an acronym. Not a very catchy one, but an MRP, a multifaceted responsible provider of critical materials. So I'm sure...
Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
Not exactly. I'm sure people in this room can come up with a better one. So supply chains, information and tools, which I can go into more if you wish. And then secondly, another key issue is the domestic approaches, both in Australia, focusing on Australia, but also Bolivia. And then thirdly, the international approach. I've been quite wowed by the talks that we've had already, and I agree with at least a couple of speakers we've had on the need for partnerships and how important they are, and I believe that Australia is absolutely in a central position to drive international partnerships for critical materials.
So you mentioned there that you've got some examples that we could talk about. So sort of what strategies and efforts are we seeing from government, from business, from NGOs, either in Australia or around the world? You talk about Bolivia as being sort of a case study example.
Yeah.
So do you want to unpack some of that for us
Sure.
at both the Australia and international level?
Yeah, so start with Australia. Australia is both a positive and a negative example. So some research that my team and I did in a paper called In the Lab which was actually conceptually developed by Professor Linda Hancock. The main issue we wanted to address was we were looking at the researchers in the centre that I actually work for. I'm based at Deakin Uni in Melbourne, but I actually work for the Australian Research Council for Electromaterial Science. So I work with a bunch of scientists in developing renewable energy technology, and we have amazing PhD students and research fellows developing all sorts of things, batteries, solar panels, hydrogen, etc., etc. And we found that when they were asked to talk about the ethical issues in what they were developing, remember they're quite focused on the chemistry of things. They're here, they're brilliant at what they do, but they don't have a global approach to things and political issues. And we found that they kind of understood the concept of conflict minerals, which the distinction between conflict minerals and critical materials. So conflict minerals.
If you could, unpack that a little bit for us.
3TG. So that's tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. They're known for conflict minerals. So think, well, actually, I was going to say DRC, Congo, but that's more cobalt, which is called to be a conflict mineral, but it's not classed officially as a conflict mineral. So what's happened is our researchers understood this concept of conflict minerals because it causes conflict, war, and violence. However, when we were actually talking to them about critical materials, they didn't actually have much idea of what that was. So we did some research on this, and what, of course, we found was like you've basically critical materials. As you know, there's like in the States 35 of them, and EU a different number. I forget now, is it 27 or something? But the key thing about critical materials is that they have a threat multiplier effect. So whereas conflict minerals, well, we know that they, when they're mined, etc., and produced, they can cause violence, war, resource wars, etc. But critical materials they're not necessarily in a conflict-affected country, but because of down the line in the future, we might actually have this exponential growth of mining for them and production. They could actually become conflict minerals. So we needed to get that across to our researchers. And during our research, just quickly, is that we found that when we went into the laboratories at Monash and Deakin, and we actually looked to see what materials they are using in batteries and solar panels, nobody really, beyond the obvious, nobody really could tell us. And so we had to look at, where what do you call it, the invoices for the materials. And so we got a list of those materials and then said, that's a conflict mineral, that's critical material, et cetera, et cetera. And then we asked the researchers, so where do you buy these materials? They didn't know. So again, we had to go and find out, and we found the key companies that provide, like Sigma Aldrich and LNF Materials, just two examples. And then we looked at the publicly available information of those companies to see what their corporate social responsibility policies were and what information they provided. And to be honest with you, Sigma Aldrich gave some information on conflict minerals and some environmental and social policies, but most of the companies that we looked at had nothing. So our researchers could not even go online and look at that company to see, well, are we getting cobalt or etc. materials for our battery? And remember, they're top-notch researchers, so that battery is most likely to go into global mass production. But our researchers couldn't even find out from their immediate supplier if that supplier had any social or environmental policies, you know, to make sure they don't cause any abuses, and certainly didn't have any information on whether they were conflict minerals or et cetera, et cetera. And so a key thing is that we need more tools, you know, to monitor along supply chains of what companies are doing. So if companies can have better information available in their corporate social responsibility policies, but then if going further up and up the supply chain, you know, so just we need more information provided by companies up the supply chain so we can check that we're actually getting ethical materials that are then going to go into the new innovative technologies, and et cetera, et cetera. Just sort of way longer than I expected.
No, so what was an example of, you talk about the Bolivia example of being best practice in terms of this tracking. Can you talk to us and tell us what that actually means, what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. Well, I wouldn't actually say, and forgive me, I've obviously expressed myself incorrectly there. I wouldn't say that Bolivia was the best example of tracking, but what is good about Bolivia is that Bolivia, as I'm sure you're aware, is one of the 3 countries in the lithium triangle. The other 2 being Argentina and Chile. And so I think they call Bolivia the Saudi Arabia of lithium because it's got the largest potential reserves in the world, etc. But the thing is, Bolivia has had a terrible history from mining. So think the Potosi silver mines, I believe, and it is basically known historically as one of the worst genocides, I think is the term that you can use there, in the world ever in history. So, and of course Bolivia is one of the most, if not the most indigenously populated countries, and also President Morales, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is an indigenous leader. So what Bolivia did was actually put into its constitution to protect the earth and the resources to be used for its people. And basically, so what President Morales wanted to do was, instead of exploiting lithium and like historically environmental, social catastrophe, basically, Bolivia wanted to actually make sure that they got the cleanest production processes and actually provide development for the local communities in the area. And so what we did, we looked at their seemingly key strategy, which is to set up public-private partnerships from Bolivian social enterprises, not social enterprises, state-owned enterprises, and quite different there really. And so state enterprises and private corporations, and we wanted to see how good these partnerships might have been for development and the environment. And it's very difficult to find information. So, and basically what we needed to do was, we just developed criteria for a framework where if we look at Bolivia, but we can also in the future look to other countries and following the same path, i.e. to reduce potential exploitation of their resources. And so we looked at how much these public-private partnerships might actually support the SDGs. SDGs being the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals internationally for the development agenda. So did these public-private partnerships actually support the SDGs? And then looked at companies involved and developing up criteria so we could evaluate, well, those companies that are involved, have they actually got any publicly available information to demonstrate that they support the SDGs? So, I mean, and just as an example of the way they might support SDGs and why it's so important is, and not just some airy-fairy, oh, let's do social work here. It's actually like, if you think of goal 12 of the SDGs is sustainable consumption and production. So this is where Bolivia wanted to develop up cleaner technologies. And then think of SDG 9, which I think I've got the right number there, which is responsible industrialization. The key thing here that Bolivia wanted to do, and I'm hoping Australia is actually doing this as well, it sounds like it from the speakers here, is not just export raw materials, but basically go along, build up the supply, go up the supply chain, and actually produce processed materials, and also things like cathodes for batteries. And I mean, Bolivia is even saying they might potentially develop electric vehicles. So, but at least, don't know how far they'll get, but the goal there is there. And I think that needs to be, as I'm sure you're willing to say, that needs to be the goal for Australia too.
Excellent. So, Eleanor, do you have some examples of best strategies that are in place either in business, government or other organisations?
The example that I thought was very interesting on not best practice, but how it's evolving at the moment. I think there is a real new awareness that environmental and social and this governance type of risks can be material for the business. So that a mine will have an effect on its local context, but there are risks that can bounce back and become a risk to business. And I think that's the key example was the tailings dam failures and the Brumadinho catastrophic failure that happened in January this year, and how the investors responded to that because they are really more aware of this now. And you had in April you had the Church of England pension board and other investors that sent letters to CEOs of 700 different mining companies asking them to disclose information about their tailings facilities. The height, the volume, the year it was built, how it's operated, what are the hazard classification for these different dams. So it was really like a push for disclosure from the investors because they realized that this kind of consequence is unacceptable. And it was interesting because a majority of the companies didn't disclose, but you had all the major companies that did disclose it. So it was kind of that separation between bigger companies that can claim good practice and maybe smaller companies that kind of stayed under the radar there. But it was very interesting for me that I thought that, okay, to me I guess it's part of this. I would say the main idea with this now is realizing that, okay, tailings dam failures, major tailings dam failures, very often in the majority of cases, they result in the mine shutting down. I think the number is 60%, like major tailings dam failure, they do result in this. Social conflicts, it's harder to anticipate, harder to quantify, harder to understand, but they do result also in mine shutdowns. They result in significant delays. They result in terrible consequences for the company's reputation with violent conflicts, with fatalities in some cases damage to property, road blockades will delay operations. So it's about quantifying the consequences of social and environmental risks and making it a business case. So I guess that's the main step. Like first, you have investors acknowledging it, businesses acknowledging these risks, and then it's quantifying it and understanding that with a better social and environmental performance, that's how you anticipate and you prevent these risks from materializing.
So that would be the key next step for Australia, you would say, in terms of managing some of these social, economic risks that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think that's the next step for the mining industry. Then I guess there are different actors playing there. I think that the civil society has become more aware of it and is playing its role in raising awareness. NGOs the same. NGOs are doing work in as you said, tracking down the minerals down the value chain and understanding where they come from. Do they come from conflict areas? So there is that whole area of we need to track better and understand where the materials come from. And that's a big challenge in doing that. So there's lots of work to do in this space.
And someone did mention earlier blockchain. What role do you both see blockchain playing in that tracking system?
I can't add to that.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about this one, but yeah.
I think it were in terms of energy, renewable energy, well, I could not answer that.
Okay, great. And so, Natalie, what would you recommend those next steps are to mitigate some of these challenges going forward?
Well, I think, I think like you were just saying, focusing on the social and environmental issues. With Australia, has such strengths in the technical strengths and the social strengths, the environmental strengths. But if we can get even better, and also in the economic sense, develop up circular economy. So, Eleanor is the expert on circular economy within the mine, definitely from what I've read of your work. And but then we need to think about more broadly, the circular economy across WA and across Australia, and then internationally, creating partnerships for the circular economy, off the top of my head, like waste, international waste, or something, so that we actually improve the circular economy approach by actually having international partnerships. So I think we need more information along the supply chains, where the materials come from, the origin, and what the mines are actually doing, socially, environmentally, etc. And if we can do that within Australian mines, and then across the Indo-Pacific through partnerships, I think, then you can say, for example, a WA mine can promote itself as being an MRP, multifaceted responsible provider, in terms of environment, economic circular, it's part of the circular economy, and all those issues. And it can actually, then Australia can say, well, we're actually the best, we do best practice. And then we can work with other countries who want to do the same, and we need, I was saying, we need tools, and by that I mean for researchers and entrepreneurs who are going to be developing the new, I always come from a renewable energy technology perspective, by the way, so these new tools to actually, say like the researchers where I work at Deakin and ACES, so they can monitor the lists, the changing lists for critical materials and the changing government policies around critical materials, and ways that they can actually have a practical impact on increasing their the ethical impact of any materials they use and any technologies they develop. So, and I think that would be quite easy to do. I think Australia, just quickly really needs to make sure, I know that it is, it's already obviously, and listening from the talks today, make sure that we don't just export raw materials, that we do go up the value chain and develop batteries. I mean, at Deakin, we've got Professor Maria Forsyth and her team, world-class battery developers. And then what Australia could do is actually merge this strategy plan to go up the value chain, developing batteries, etc., within a renewable energy export strategy. So by that, I mean, there's already talk to and projects going forward to export hydrogen to Japan, etc. There's talk about exporting electricity over to generated by renewable energy, which needs the batteries and the critical materials. Generating electricity over to Indonesia in the future, So I think Australia really needs a good strategy for renewable energy exports that actually includes a very good strategy around ethical critical materials production. And just finally, I would like to say that I think, geopolitics is talked so much about in critical materials and renewable energy now, which is very important because we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past with our energy, oil and coal, with fossil fuels. However, I do think that, we create the world, the way we see the world is the way it will be and will be in the future. So if we focus heavily on, these sort of geopolitical fears, like we're going to have competition for critical materials and electricity across international grids. It's going to be used as a weapon. If these issues need to be looked at, but I think we need a very positive or much more positive approach. So turn security arguments on their head and have a more constructive and what we'd say in academic language, more peace-building perspective. I know that the word peace is often not sort of respected heavily, but so if we can actually, instead of security from threats, have security with partners overseas. And we can actually then, I think Australia really has a good chance, as I said earlier, of being at the hub of generating multilateral, bilateral agreements for the stewardship of these materials and actually making sure these supply chains are truly ethical, and then encouraging joint ventures within these responsible supply chains. And yeah, I think Australia needs to step back, think of its strategy, and look at everything it can do to have this ethical approach, and then promote itself alongside its partners in the Asia-Pacific.
Thanks very much, Natalie.
Thank
Natalie, excuse me, and Eleanor, thank you very much for opening up this really important discussion about integrity of supply chains. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And look forward to speaking with you more throughout today. Thank you.